Hollywood's most despicable actors according to Lee Marvin. Born on February 19, 1924, in New York City, Lee Marvin came from a well-off but strict family. His father, Courtney Washington Marvin, was an advertising executive, and his mother, Lamont Waldman Marvin, was a beauty writer and consultant. The family valued education and refinement, but young Lee was a wild spirit. He grew up in upstate New York, where he often found himself in trouble not because he was bad, but because he hated rules and routine. School didn't interest him. He was expelled from several institutions, including St. Leo College Preparatory School, for behavior that teachers called defiant and impossible. Despite his rebellious youth, those early struggles helped shape the man he would become. The toughness, the raw honesty, and the no-nonsense attitude were all born from those years of fighting against authority. That same intensity would later make his on-screen characters feel real because they came from a place of truth. When World War II broke out, everything changed. At just 18 years old, Marvin enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps. He was assigned to the Pacific Theater, where he faced some of the bloodiest battles of the war. During the Battle of Saipan, he led an assault on a Japanese position and was struck by machine gun fire. The wound was serious, bad enough to end his military career. He was awarded the Purple Heart, among other honors, for his bravery. But the war left more than scars on his body. It changed him inside. Marvin carried the memories of death, fear, and survival with him for the rest of his life. After being discharged, Marvin returned home unsure of what to do next. For a while, he worked odd jobs, including as a plumber's assistant. It was while repairing a toilet in a small community theater that fate stepped in. An actor didn't show up for rehearsal, and Marvin was asked to fill in. That single moment lit a fire in him. He found something that gave him purpose: performing. Soon he began taking acting lessons in New York, appearing in off-Broadway plays, and slowly building a reputation as a powerful new talent. Marvin's Hollywood debut came in 1951 with You're in the Navy Now. His natural presence and deep, commanding voice caught everyone's attention. He wasn't the typical movie star, not handsome in a conventional way, not polished, but he had something others didn't: authenticity. Throughout the 1950s, he became a familiar face in war movies and westerns, often playing villains or soldiers. He appeared in hits like The Big Heat 1953, The Wild One 1953, and Bad Day at Black Rock 1955. In each role, Marvin brought something raw and real, a sense of lived experience that no acting coach could teach. His big breakthrough came in 1965 with Cat Ballou, where he played both a drunken gunslinger and his evil twin. The performance was unforgettable, funny, dark, and deeply human all at once. It won him the Academy Award for Best Actor, confirming his place among Hollywood's elite. From there, he starred in classics like The Professionals 1966, The Dirty Dozen 1967, and Point Blank 1967. Lee Marvin had become the ultimate symbol of strength, masculinity, and independence. But behind the success was a man still haunted by his past. The discipline he learned in war stayed with him, and so did his hatred for arrogance and dishonesty. He couldn't stand people who faked toughness or treated others with disrespect. And that's why, later in life, he openly spoke about several stars he considered the worst people he'd ever met in Hollywood. He called them the most despicable men I ever worked with. The first name on his list was Tony Curtis. Marvin didn't hide his contempt for Curtis, calling him vain and self-absorbed. Tony thought he was the next Cary Grant, Marvin once said. But he didn't have the class, the grit, or the humility. Though they never worked together directly, Marvin saw Curtis often at Universal Studios. He claimed Curtis treated crew members poorly and spent more time looking in mirrors than learning his lines. He could act when he wanted to, Marvin said, but most of the time he was just performing for himself. The second was Robert Mitchum. Both men were known for playing rugged, masculine roles, but off-camera, Marvin didn't like him at all. Mitchum had a mean streak when he drank, he said. He'd charm you 1 minute and throw a punch the next. Marvin accused him of being cruel to women and people who couldn't fight back. A real man doesn't bully, he said. Mitchum did, and I lost respect for him. Third was George Peppard. Marvin thought Peppard's ego made him unbearable to work with. He believed being difficult made him a better actor, Marvin said, but showing up late, disrespecting directors, and treating co-stars like props, that's not talent. That's insecurity. Marvin, who valued professionalism above all else, saw Peppard as the type who thought a movie couldn't be made without him. The truth, Marvin said, is that films are made in spite of people like that. Fourth was Frank Sinatra. This one hurt Marvin the most because he admired Sinatra's music. Frank had a god complex, he said. He snapped his fingers and expected everyone to jump. Marvin recalled a moment when Sinatra screamed at a cameraman during a shoot. That told me everything I needed to know, Marvin said quietly. Talent doesn't excuse cruelty. Fifth on his list was Montgomery Clift. Critics loved Clift for his emotional depth, but Marvin found his behavior frustrating. Monty was brilliant, no doubt, he admitted, but he was too self-destructive. He'd drink himself sick before a scene, then fall apart when things got tough. Marvin, a Marine who respected discipline, couldn't understand Clift's weakness. You can't respect a man who gives up on himself, he said. The sixth was Marlon Brando. Marvin's words about him were brutal. Brando could have been the greatest actor who ever lived, he said, but he was too wrapped up in his own nonsense. They moved in the same circles during the height of method acting, and Marvin thought Brando's approach was more therapy than craft. He'd show up unprepared, make everyone wait, and act like the world revolved around his mood. That's not art, that's indulgence. And finally, the seventh, Dean Martin. Marvin's criticism of him surprised many because the two shared a love of westerns and a reputation for heavy drinking. Dean was charming on screen, Marvin said, but off camera, he could be cold. He didn't care about anyone but himself. Marvin accused Martin of being lazy and distant. He'd coast through takes, do the bare minimum, and walk off laughing. The man never took the craft seriously, and to me, that's the greatest insult of all. For Marvin, acting was sacred. He believed that movies were built on teamwork, respect, and dedication. Fame meant nothing if you lacked integrity. I never cared how big your name was, he once said. If you didn't have character, you were nothing to me. Despite his harsh opinions, Marvin wasn't bitter. He simply believed in honesty. His life had taught him that greatness came from struggle, not ego. He'd seen death, pain, and hardship, and those experiences made him allergic to arrogance. Off-screen, Marvin lived a complicated but meaningful life. He married twice, first to Betty Ebeling, with whom he had 4 children, and later to Pamela Feely, who stayed by his side until the end. He battled alcohol for years but found peace later in life, especially after moving to Tucson, Arizona. There, he spent his final years sailing, fishing, and enjoying the quiet he'd earned. In the late 1970s, he was dragged into a highly publicized legal battle, the Marvin v. Marvin Palimony case, brought by a former partner who claimed half his earnings. The case became a landmark in U.S. law, introducing the term palimony. Through it all, Pamela supported him unconditionally. Lee Marvin died in 1987 from complications of lung disease, the result of years of heavy smoking and hard living. He was 63. At his funeral, friends described him as a man who lived by his own code. For those who knew him, he was more than a Hollywood star. He was a soldier, a truth teller, and a man who refused to compromise his values. In a world full of pretenders, Lee Marvin was the real thing. And when he called someone despicable, it wasn't out of spite. It was because, in his eyes, they had betrayed the very spirit of the craft he loved. Lee Marvin's story reminds us that integrity lasts longer than fame. The lights of Hollywood fade, but a man's character that's to be the early 1980s. Lee Marvin was no longer the fierce young Marine who had stormed the beaches of Sapin, nor the rugged anti-hero who had dominated Hollywood's toughest films. Time had begun to claim him, the same way it eventually claims every fighter, every dreamer, every soul who dares to live without compromise. He had faced everything: war, fame, failure, lawsuits, heartbreak, but what made him unique was how he faced them, without fear. Marvin never believed in pretending. He was never one to soften his words or hide behind polite lies. So when his health began to fail, he didn't hide from that either. He met it head-on, like a soldier facing one last mission. Years of hard drinking, chain smoking, and endless nights on set had left their mark. His deep voice, once booming and full of power, had grown rougher. He would joke that he sounded like gravel being poured into a metal bucket. But there was still that fire, that spark that made everyone around him stop and listen. He lived quietly in Tucson, Arizona, with his wife Pamela, far from the cameras and the noise of Hollywood. The desert suited him. He liked the silence, the vast open skies, the sunsets that painted the world gold before fading into darkness. It was a landscape as raw and honest as he was. Pamela often said that Lee found peace there, not in crowds or red carpets, but in the small things, fixing a boat engine, feeding stray dogs, sitting on the porch at night with a glass in hand and the radio playing old jazz. He didn't want to be remembered as a star, she once said softly. He just wanted to be remembered as a man who tried to do right, but his body was breaking down. The years of abuse had taken their toll on his lungs and heart. He developed chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a condition that made every breath a struggle. Doctors warned him that if he didn't quit smoking, he'd lose his life. Lee just smiled and said, "I've been on borrowed time since Sapin." In his last interviews, you could sense a man reflecting on everything he'd lived through. When asked about fame, he laughed. "Fame is a ghost," he said. "It disappears the moment you try to hold on to it. What matters is what kind of man you were when the lights go out." He spoke of his friends who'd passed, soldiers from the war, old actors he'd shared whiskey and laughter with. Each death hit him harder. "You reach a point," he said quietly, "where every goodbye feels heavier than the last." By 1986, he rarely left his home. The strong, commanding presence that once filled movie screens had grown frail. Yet, even in his weakest moments, Lee Marvin never lost that edge of humor. When a friend visited and said, "You're looking thin," Marvin chuckled and said, "Good, I'm finally getting the movie star body they wanted me to have." In the spring of 1987, his condition worsened. He was admitted to a hospital in Tucson, where he spent his final days surrounded by his wife and close friends. There were no crowds, no cameras, no reporters waiting outside. Just peace and silence. On August 29, 1987, Lee Marvin took his final breath. The man who had survived war, Hollywood politics, and personal demons finally let go. He was 63 years old. His death hit the film world hard. Directors, actors, and fans around the globe mourned the loss of a man who had never pretended to be anything other than himself. Some called him the last real man of Hollywood. Others said he was the embodiment of a lost era when men were raw, flawed, and unapologetically human. He was laid to rest with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery in Virginia, a fitting resting place for a man who had lived like a warrior and died with a soldier's dignity. The Marines fired their rifles, the flag was folded, and the sound of taps echoed through the still air. Pamela stood silently, tears streaming down her face. As the man she had loved was saluted one final time, there's something haunting about his grave, simple, unpretentious, marked only by his name, his rank, and his service record. No quotes, no glamour, no reminders of Hollywood, just the truth of who he really was, even in death. Lee Marvin refused to be anything other than real. His legacy endures not because of the awards or the fame, but because of his honesty, his refusal to play by anyone else's rules. He showed the world that strength isn't about being invincible. It's about standing tall even when the world tries to break you. To this day, his movies play late at night on old channels, where his gravelly voice still echoes across time. Somewhere, out in the Arizona desert, the wind moves across the sand like a whisper, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear him laugh and say, "Tell it like it is, kid. Don't ever fake it." That was Lee Marvin, way raw, defiant, and real to the very end. And that is how he should always be remembered, not just as an actor, not just as a Marine, but as a man who never stopped fighting to live by his own code, because in the end, every legend fades, but truth never dies.